Andrew Weiss, our distinguished speaker this evening, is one of the country's top experts on Russia. And his new book on Putin and his life and lies, it's a history of Russia as well as of Putin. And it's the format of a graphic novel makes for some unforgettable images. I gave a copy to a friend last week in Florida, and today I got his review. Let me quote from it. He said, "It is a riveting tale and an amazing accomplishment, a work of genius. It is a great way to tell an important story. The book should be a bestseller. People need to know what we're up against. It's 1,000 years of culture and tradition, a powerful nation state based on central power and personal authority." And my friend added, "It left me depressed." And yes, it did have a deeply unsatisfying ending. Enough said. I happen to agree with what he wrote. Andrew Weiss worked as a specialist on Russia in both the Republican and Democratic administrations, serving at the White House National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon. He's now vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, which means that he supervises Carnegie's superb think tank in Moscow. It's been closed, like so many independent think tanks and journalists and media, by the Russian government in April. But its experts are still producing excellent papers, and they draw on for one thing, on the Levada Center, which is Russia's most respected pollster. Tonight he'll speak on demystifying Vladimir Putin. Over to you, Andrew Weiss.
Thank you so much, Roy. So I want to cover three big topics quickly, and then open things up for questions. And I really hope this will be a back and forth and an exchange of ideas and views about someone as captivating as Vladimir Putin, and some of the policy challenges that we've got to confront. And so the three big issues I just want to talk about with folks this evening are: why would somebody like me write a graphic novel about Putin, or just a graphic novel in general? Two, what are the big takeaways, or 3 or 4 big ideas I hope people will come away from reading this book with? And then lastly, what is this book going to tell you about the war in Ukraine that you don't already know? So with that preface, I'm going to open up my little handy slide presentation here and show people some images from the book as a way of informing you and telling you the broader story. So for those of you who don't read graphic novels, I'm only a mini graphic novel nerd. I wouldn't say I'm a big one. It's a genre that's been around for the past 30 years or so. And what's interesting about it is the books that are really powerful in this genre reach across all generations and ages, and they tackle really hard subjects. Right now, there's a big debate in our country about book banning, and if you look at some of the books that are most prominent in the lists of titles that are being removed from school libraries, a lot of them are in this format, and they touch on the Holocaust. There's a book called Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which was out in about 25 years ago, which is about a Holocaust survivor's charged relationship with his son, who becomes a cartoonist. There's a more recent book that's out right now called Genderqueer, which has been removed from a lot of libraries around the country, that deals with LGBTQ equality issues and personal history. A couple of my favorites for this audience, just to flag one, is called Persepolis, which is about the experience of an Iranian family in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and a young woman's striving to get an education and become an artist. There's another book called Belonging, by Nora Krug, who's a German-American writer who talks about reckoning with her family's complicity in the Holocaust. And then lastly, there's a book called Arab of the Future by Riyad Sattouf that looks at the experiences of growing up in Libya and in Saudi Arabia in the 70s with a radical Arab intellectual as your father and a French mother. So anyways, all of these books deal with really hard-hitting issues, and they're no less powerful because of the format. And based on what Roy just said, it sounds like at least some people are seeing what I've done here as having a comparable impact potentially to some of these real classic books. I would never compare myself to them, but my goal in writing this was to really sort of captivate different age groups, different audience segments, because foreign policy experts like me, I'm privileged. I sit in a wonderful institution like the Carnegie Endowment, but a lot of the time people like me are basically engaged in circular conversations. We're talking largely to each other. There's nothing inherently wrong about that, but I saw writing this kind of book as a way of breaking out of that insularity. And to the extent, oftentimes people like me are talking to the public, we're doing it through the good offices of people like Roy in the media. And that may not be the best way always to convey the 30,000-foot view or the long-term picture. And that's a big part of what I try to do in this book, is not just tell people the story of who Putin is, but to really explain what Russia is, why Russia is different, why it's such an important presence on the global stage, and how it got to be the kind of country it is today. And so just to show you this slide here, this is a summary of the impact of geography on Russia's destiny. And it quotes one of my favorite academic experts of the Hoover Institution most recently, but before that for 30 years at Princeton, Stephen Kotkin, sort of explaining how the fact that Russia lacked natural geographic boundaries put the regime that ruled that country for the past 1,000 years largely on a pathway of using territorial expansion to safeguard its security. And the quote in the bottom right, the top right corner here, explaining how much Russia grew over the course of centuries, it's really kind of staggering when you think about how long and enduring that path of expansionism was for this country's formative experience and presence on the world stage. Likewise, I also think for a book like this, there's a whole cohort of younger readers who probably don't remember the Cold War, let alone 9/11. And for people like that, especially, they're inundated with a lot of information in the news environment that we all live in. And there's not a lot that contextualizes things or puts things in their proper perspective. And so likewise, in this chart, on the left-hand side, what I'm trying to, in this clip from the book, what I'm trying to really explain here is the feudalistic nature of Russia and why the rule of law and institutions don't matter so much as personal connections and unwritten understandings. And the historical roots of this are quite interesting. And on the panel on the right, which I hope you can see, I've shown the impact of the fact that Russia was ruled by the Mongols for about 200 years, and that the Mongols basically left Russians alone, but demanded a form of tribute every year in the form of hefty taxes. That sort of behavior is still, kind of I think a meaningful characteristic of how Russia operates today. And then in the bottom right corner, you'll see that private property never emerged in Russia for about 500 years until after it had already been established in England. So the notion of property rights and the connection between the czar and the state have really been intrinsic to the nature of Russian statehood going back centuries. And it's really not been the case, except for this brief period in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, that some of this has been done differently. So that the roots of history are really quite pervasive in how Russia is ruled, as well as the way Russia's current rulers see their role. And likewise, when I was thinking about the book, I had this idea in my mind of Putin has such an outsized impact on people's lives, but we don't always really know what makes him tick. And of course, with any public figure, you can't get inside their heads. But the picture on the left of the brain, I think, is still the most captivating image I've ever heard from a former colleague, a government official, who explained to me what it was like dealing with Putin. And it was this image of the three hemispheres of Putin's brain. The first hemisphere is all the garbage that's poured into Putin's head day in, day out by the career Russian bureaucracy and the intelligence services. And it's all conspiracy laden and warped and doesn't really align with the real world. The second hemisphere are the 20 plus years of things he personally has been involved with and all the grievances and experiences that he's accumulated throughout his more than 2 decades in power. And then the third quadrant or hemisphere of his brain is the real world. And it's the one that we all live in, and all the facts and all the information that we all take for granted. And the problem with dealing with Putin, as I say in the bottom panel, is he's constantly toggling back and forth among these three sections of his brain. And you never know when you're talking to him which part of that brain is dealing with you. And it's very maddening. And it, I think, creates a lot of the frustration that's built up, not just as a result of the war, but in the years prior, that, you know, talking to him is in part a waste of time because the man just doesn't listen and has such strong sense of grievance against the Western interlocutors that he deals with. Lastly, you know, I was really hoping that, you know, we would, you know, also focus a bit in this conversation about the myths and the sense that Putin is this larger than life figure. And it's, you know, we can talk about how the myths came to be, but the myths now in some ways have become the reality. And so despite the fact that Putin was never a distinguished KGB operative, he had a very, you know, lackluster career. He was an accidental president who was basically selected as part of an informal, unwritten understanding with his predecessor's entourage, the Yeltsin family, to protect them and their ill-gotten gains from any kind of accountability. Despite all that, he's grown into the role. And so at some point, you know, the question is, you know, the myths are there, and to what extent is he just playing this role of the kind of larger than life strongman? I don't mean to pretend that he's not formidable. He clearly is. But, you know, at the same time, there's something about him, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, where he often lets his emotions get the best of him. And we see this in the war in Ukraine, where, you know, he's clearly been willing to torpedo nearly all of the economic progress Russia's made over 3+ decades. He's basically deglobalized the economy and disconnected Russia from the international mainstream, and now obviously led to, you know, unknown level of loss of life and huge devastation all across Ukraine. So, you know, it's like, what is it about Ukraine? That brings me to the question of sort of what is it we get wrong about Putin, and what is it that we're misperceiving? And part of that is, as I was saying, these myths. And so for the past 20+ years or so, the Kremlin has been foisting an image on us of Putin as super spy and trying to convince us that he's this cunning operative who, schooled in the dark arts of the KGB, you know, can run circles around Western governments. And there are plenty of illustrations of how he has, in fact, done that. But, you know, what I think it really speaks to is the Russians' ability to get inside our heads and plant a theme or an image, and then we all sort of internalize that and start responding to it as if it's the reality. And what the Kremlin doesn't want you to know was that Putin was actually not successful in the KGB, and that in fact his impulsivity, and I'll come back to this in a minute, and emotionalism actually led to his being sent to a backwater assignment in East Germany in the twilight days of the Cold War. And being in Dresden was not where you would end up if you were a high flyer. But something very important happened in Dresden in 1989. And I talk about this at some length in the book. Dresden was a central part of the unraveling of the DDR. And there were spontaneous street demonstrations on the streets of Dresden that Putin himself presumably was aware of, if not witnessed. And those, I think, left a sort of unshakable concern in his mind about what happens in a regimented authoritarian society when the screws are loosened and when people start taking matters into their own hands. And we see this now play out time and time again throughout Putin's rule as what he calls color revolutions. And what Putin seems to be talking about when he uses that term is the idea that the KGB, you know, just as in his eyes, the KGB has secret plots and does things around the world to establish its interest and promote Russia's interest. Surely the United States does similar things and has used the tool of people power and street revolution as a way to put pressure on regimes it doesn't like and to marginalize countries like Russia. And so a lot of what we're seeing today in Ukraine, I think, ultimately is a reflection of his deep conviction that that's what has driven events in Ukraine, that this is not something that the people of Ukraine have any agency or authorship of, but rather this is something that Western adversaries have done in Ukraine to put pressure on Russia. And that the events of 2014, where there was a popular revolution, or in 2004, were all sort of cooked up in the State Department or the US intelligence community. But anyways, long story short, what people have been taught about Putin as this cunning sort of KGB agent is largely artifice. And what we don't see is that, Putin as a kid really loved Soviet pop culture, and it was that love of Soviet pop culture glorifying the KGB that enticed him into joining the KGB in the first place. And when he took office, there was a effort basically to try to convince the Russian people that he was in fact a super spy, and convince people that their country was in solid state of hands after Yeltsin's erratic tenure as Russia's president. And what's funny about all this is that, at some point, I think I have a slide here of, no, I'm sorry, I don't have it, of Putin, playing this role. We've all internalized it. And now the role is in our heads something larger than life, when in fact, maybe it's not quite what we're dealing. And so my literary agent had an idea for an alternative title for this book, which I'm still sort of kicking myself I didn't use, which was The Spy Who Came In from Middle Management. And I think that is also a theme about what we're dealing with Putin, with someone who, overreaches, or whose intelligence agencies are not exactly all they're cracked up to be, and who leave, huge, spectacular messes in their wake. Last couple of quick points, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion about Ukraine. About a year ago, a Carnegie colleague and I, Eugene Rumer, wrote a scholarly paper entitled Ukraine, Russia, Putin's Unfinished Business. And the paper, which was written in October, was passed around in samizdat form in various parts of the US government and Western governments. And it really laid out why Putin was planning to go to war, what the strategic imperative in his mind was, and where, and I think this is crucial, where does the sort of opportunism and impulsive side of Putin come into play? And so just really quickly to sort of sketch the argument of the paper, what we believed was that, after 8 years, Putin had not gotten what he'd wanted in Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians, with a lot of strong Western support, had basically fought the Russians to a standstill. And what he really wanted was a Ukraine that was structurally beholden to the Kremlin, and would not have true independence, not have true sovereignty, and would give the Russians essentially a veto over any major foreign or domestic policy decisions. And there was just no way to get that. No Ukrainian president was going to give him that. Anyone who tried to do that would have been eaten alive politically. But then something happened. And the something that happened, as Roy was mentioning with your most recent speaker, General Votel, was the U.S. Collapse of the collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan government in summer 2021. And I think the Russians, in a kind of case of inaccurate pattern matching, assumed that something similar would happen in Ukraine, and that a U.S. proxy regime, this is their terminology, not mine, if you put a lot of pressure on it militarily and through other means, would essentially collapse, and that you would see that the same thing that happened in Afghanistan. People don't have any commitment to this government. They're not going to fight and die for it. And it just portrayed to me just total illiteracy about what Ukraine is, how people of Ukraine have been committed to their independence going back to 1991, when they voted in a national referendum that was the death warrant for the Soviet Union, and then again fought down the stolen election in 2004 and leading up to the the Orange Revolution, and then again in 2014 in the Revolution of Dignity. So again, Putin lives during COVID in this kind of ahistorical world. He marinates himself in a lot of fake history about how Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and how Ukraine is not a real country. This is something Putin has repeatedly said to Western leaders, including President Bush, that Ukraine basically is cobbled together as a result of gifts from the Soviet Union and other Western countries. So it's not a real country. And if you try to take it over, if you basically put pressure on it, it's going to all fall apart like a house of cards. The other two factors that I think really played into Putin's decision to launch the war were the departure of Angela Merkel as Germany's leader. So there was a sense that Europe was kind of rudderless, and that there would be no real effective transatlantic response to whatever Russia tried to pull off through its lightning raid on Ukraine that began on February 24th. And then lastly, the Zelensky government, lest we forget, was mired in a series of crises, many of which were of its own making. So Zelensky did not look like the leader he's become on the world stage. He looked like someone who had come to power but had failed rather dramatically to deliver on the promises he made as a candidate. So anyways, that's my sort of quick summary of the book.
Well, thank you, Andrew, very much. One question that comes up right away from your own statements just now is that Putin was rated as a ne'er-do-well and a maybe a failure by the KGB in their initial ratings, and his all of his initial assignments, and yet he has risen to great heights. And effectiveness. I mean, as you say, he's sort of run circles around Western leaders, but I also think of his presentations to his annual press conference, which I guess he's not having this year, where he fields questions for a full hour from all over the place. And does it handily. Okay, so did the KGB underestimate him?
It's a good question, Roy, and it's a hard one to answer. There's no doubt that Putin is a hard worker, and this was part of what distinguished him to the Yeltsin family at the beginning of his rise to power in 1999. There's no doubt that he studies hard. He also got himself into the most prestigious law school in Leningrad, which was no small feat for a working class kid from the wrong side of the tracks. He's mastered judo, he mastered German, so this is a person who has displayed great work ethic and discipline at various stages of his life. In my own encounters with him, which were 20 plus years ago, so everyone changes, he struck me as someone who was well briefed, but not super deep, and was going, an inch or two into his material, not much more than that. But being in power for a long time has created a couple of sort of phenomena, some of which are favorable, some of which are unfavorable. The favorable ones is he's really experienced. And with the exception of Joe Biden, who's been at this, as everyone knows, since the early 70s, there's really no one on the world stage who's got the length of tenure that Vladimir Putin has. And he has witnessed so much over the past 20 years and knows these issues cold. And I think, given that he's a hard worker, when you put him into these prepared settings, whether it's the sort of Castro style or Hugo Chavez style, ask me anything on TV, or leaders summit meeting, he knows his brief, and he's a very nimble person and knows how to outmaneuver, especially someone like Donald Trump, who he had no trouble with. But he knows the game. I think the problem is that Putin's successes that accrued, particularly after 2013, and I sort of date this to 2013 because that's when Edward Snowden showed up in Moscow, and you had this kind of series of Russian wins. The U.S. was discredited internationally as a result of the illegal disclosures that Snowden made about various U.S. intelligence collection programs and cyber activities. In 2014, you had this masterstroke, or what was perceived as a masterstroke, in seizing Crimea and launching the covert war in eastern Ukraine. 2015, you had the successful Russian military intervention in Syria, and Russia saved the Assad regime, which many people believed was on its last legs. 2016, you had the great coup de grace of helping Donald Trump be elected president of the United States, and then having basically a Putin apologist serving as the president of the United States for 4 years, and all the disarray and disruption that created huge opportunities for Russia throughout. So it's not surprising to me that the man built a sense, like anyone would, that I'm at the craps table and I keep winning. And that was in part why he was willing to make such a dramatic bet on invading Ukraine on February 24th. And it's one of the most, it's hard to think of any blunder in national security and foreign policy of this scale. I mean, this is truly an epic blunder and miscalculation.
Yes, he definitely blew it. His whole reputation, in fact. So let me go to some questions here. Some of them are historical and intriguing. Sam Dell asks that he had read in a book about the feudal system of inheritance that was used there, that you mentioned in the book, in fact. That it did not, that inheritance did not pass through primogeniture, but horizontally across males of each generation. The conclusion was that this had an enormous impact on the way Russian society works. since serfs were part of the property, loyalty would be transitory and focused on short-term gains. Does this help explain where Russia is today?
I'm not a historian. I think that this issue definitely made for unruly governance because parcels that belonged to a member of the aristocracy or the nobility became smaller as they were divided up. So you ended up without the same kind of, landed estates and stakeholders in the system that you had in Western Europe, where estates were bigger and families became more powerful over time. I think that the theme that I really focus on in the book a lot are the themes that really speak to me the most are the notion of temporary ownership. And so for a certain period of Russian history, nobles didn't get title to the lands they were in charge of, and they could be rotated around at the whim of the czar. And that sort of created a sense among all the nobles of that they were expendable. And if you extrapolate that out to the current moment, we all have this fascination with what people call Russian oligarchs. And there's always this sense that, maybe someday the oligarchs will all march into Putin's office and tell the boss that what he's doing is harmful to their well-being. All those people know that their title is not firm to the things they control, and that they're not that different from those aristocrats I was alluding to a minute ago. So it seems really improbable to me that we'll ever see the Russian elite sort of snap out of its position of submissiveness and dependency on the sovereign. The other thing that I think also really is hard for us to grasp, but is really important, is that because nothing is locked in and there are no institutions, no one trusts anyone else. And it's, the institutions to enforce disputes or laws that might guide people's behavior don't exist. And it also, I think, plays into the mentality the Russians have of not the Russian leadership of not trusting the United States or the Ukrainians for that matter, because people just don't expect that in a deal you can enforce things. The way you enforce things is by being powerful and scaring people. And that's sort of the glue, that plus corruption are the sort of glue that keeps a lot of the system going.
Well, another question in the same area is that Russia had serfs for a very long time, although I think it freed them before the U.S. freed its slaves. But nevertheless, the serfs were part of the system, and maybe the mentality is still there in some ways. And having a powerful leader goes with having serfs. Do you see the Russian people with that history rising up against Putin? Would there be a violent revolution or peaceful political change, or will it happen at all?
It's anybody's guess. So, from your lips to God's ears, I think that that we could ever expect some change. I mean, at some point, this regime will end. It's rickety. The state and its institutions are fundamentally flawed and heavily personalistic. And as we've seen with this criminal war in Ukraine, one man made a really bad blunder, and it's now causing huge, lasting reverberations throughout society. But, and this is the big but, there's tendencies within the behavior and the attitudes of average people in Russia, and I don't want to generalize, but if you aggregate those, a lot of those attitudes are very passive. The Russian people are very atomized. They're very depoliticized, and they're very risk averse. And so they've lived through tumult, or a great number of them have lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and all the deprivation and economic dislocation. And they don't want to go through that again. And so there's a vote for continuity and stability that's built in to what Putin is dealing with. And then, lest we forget, by keeping the borders open and occasionally fostering fear of martial law or border closure, the Russians have very cunningly flushed out of the country the people who are most likely to be the most unhappy. And they've provided yet another element of stability to Putin's rule by getting people out of the country that could cause trouble or who might want a better Russia or a different Russia instead of the one they're dealing with. And then lastly, and I mean, again, I don't mean to make things culturally determinative or assume that history, and all these other things dictates what's going to be in the present. But it's important to remember that Russia is like a pretty inhospitable, difficult place to live in terms of its climate, in terms of its economy, in terms of its endowment of natural resources. And going back to medieval period, if you look at the behavior in the village, the person who went to the village and said, hey, we can rotate our crops this year and we'll get higher yields, that person was not welcomed in the village because the margin for survival, there's a great segment of one of the Harvard historian Richard Pipe's books about this, the margin in an everyday village in Siberia between survival and failure and death was always pretty small. And anyone who came into these village discussions with a great idea was often chased out of town because that was just too risky.
So you were saying that essentially Russia has no institutions, no that stand up to Putin. I mean, there is one institution, and maybe it falls in that category of not standing up to Putin, and that's the Orthodox Church. How do you describe the relationship between Putin and the Orthodox Church?
There's definitely been periods where the church has its own interests, and those interests seem to diverge from those of the state. But for the most part, the church is highly servile and very much an instrument of the authority. And the current patriarch, who's a longtime alleged KGB collaborator, Patriarch Kirill, identifies the role of the church as basically being an appendage of the state. There's been a huge surge in the trappings of moral conservatism and believing, or I'm trying to find the right term, in trying to embrace the customs and the tradition of the Orthodox Church that Putin himself has pushed onto the Russian elite. And you see a lot of members of the Russian elite all scrambling to kind of mimic Putin. Some of this is sincere. I don't want to judge people's religious practices, but some of it is artifice. And this also is a big theme in the book, which is that in 2011, 2012, when people will remember there were these big street protests that erupted spontaneously in Moscow and other major Russian cities, the people who went out and protested were by and large, the main beneficiaries of Putin's very successful first decade in office. And they were the middle class and the most well-to-do people in these cities. And they, basically felt humiliated by Putin's decision to return to the Kremlin and basically say that Dmitry Medvedev's role as Russia's president was basically a ruse to get around term limits. But what was striking at that moment, and people may remember this, when Putin accused Hillary Clinton of launching street demonstrations and that the State Department had organized all this stuff, Putin at that point really just put on this whole fakery of being a moral conservative and tried to portray any of the street protesters as being, Western agents or pro-LGBTQ, and tried to make it seem like, they're not like you. They're not like you, Joe Sixpack Russia. And he was speaking very much to the base electorate in provincial Russia and in Russia's smaller cities that resent that segment of Russian society that's most westernized and affluent. So I again, it comes back to the myths that are at the heart of this book. People in the United States, particularly in the conservative movement, have bought into this image of Putin as a moral conservative or Putin as a proponent of family values, and they don't seem to get it. They don't seem to understand that much of this was done for politically expedient reasons to basically marginalize and attack voices inside Russian society that wanted the country to be ruled differently. And it worked really well, I think, and now it's working phenomenally well because, almost all those people have decided to leave.
Is it possible that Russia could do what Japan did and go from a feudal system with a very, very powerful emperor and enter a law-driven capitalist style democracy? Or are there too many factors operating against it? Geography, history, and certainly Russian history of expansion and addressing all of its internal issues. Sometimes or so it seems, by trying to expand and grab other territory.
It's a wonderful thought experiment to imagine what kind of circumstances would need to be present to see Russia break with this trajectory. And it's in the book. I would love to see a Russia like that emerge. There was a period in the 1990s when Russia seemed to be on that kind of a course. It was a horribly botched transition. It had problems where people's expectations got out of line with reality, criminality and vacuums, left by the collapse of the Soviet system, discredited some of these ideas. So, Putin in the first decade plus of his rule has tried to portray what was done in the 1990s as basically an insult, as a malicious effort by the West to bring Russia to its knees, and has tried to make the Russian people feel humiliated and foster an idea that, the West is your enemy and don't let this horrible, bad period of the 1990s ever come back. So it's just very hard for me to imagine a post-Putin Russia where someone sweeps into power and says, for 20 years, all the stuff you guys have been hearing about Western democracy is wrong, et cetera, and then sort of, manages to pull that off. It's not to say that it can't happen, but right now, the odds of Russia achieving a fundamental break with this very personalistic style of rule, this very arbitrary approach to governance, deep embedded corruption, which creates a lot of vested interests who have no interest in seeing the country go on a different trajectory. And then finally, the impact of the war, where you have just incredible levels of isolation. Russia today is more isolated politically and economically than at any point since maybe the 1920s, when the Soviet Union was still in its infancy. So it's just really, it's a really tall hill to climb.
Well, what if Russia were defeated by the Ukrainians and shamed and had to basically leave Ukraine? That would be a defeat like 1905, which led to a revolution. Is that a possibility now, or is that wishful thinking?
Again, from your lips to God's ears, I think it will be extremely hard for the Ukrainian military to push Russia completely out of the country. And, there's still, many chapters of this war that lie ahead of us, very long and painful conflict and months, if not years of fighting that will still be ahead of us. The Ukrainians have done incredibly well due to the fact that they're fighting for their very survival, that they feel that they're facing a quasi-genocidal invader. They are getting huge amounts of Western and particularly US support. All these things matter a great deal. And the fact that the entire country is essentially mobilized to fight, with all men under, I think it's 50, are now mobilized. I mean, this is, again, it's a miraculous tale of national survival and heroism. The Russian defeats in 1905 and 1917, when there were these major collapses and defeats, sent huge shockwaves through the system. And there's a sense, you can't really put your finger on it, that the Russian elite know that that's something, that could happen here, that the country has stumbled into a completely pointless, unprovoked war on a generally friendly neighbor, and that it's all gone horribly badly. But there's something in Russian, again, I feel bad about trafficking and stereotypes, but there's this word in Russian which I think really captures a lot of the national psyche, which is avos. And it's basically a kind of disempowerment that Russians feel about their own fate, in a sense that everything's in God's hands. So whether I get COVID is not up to me. It's not whether I mask or I behave a certain way in public. It's God who'll decide. And you see this in the way the Russians debate what might replace the Putin system. Very few of them are talking about, here are the things that I can do, or my my colleagues and I can pull off that might bring about a different type of Russia. It's always pointing to something else, like something out in the provinces or some externality, as if, the only way change occurs is through someone else's actions, not your own.
So you don't see Generation Z as saving Russia? I mean, I suppose most of Generation Z has left the country, huh?
I don't think it's mostly left the country. I think the most talented members who had, skills, education, and the financial resources to make it somewhere else have done that. The problem is Russia is an aging society. And if you look at the bands of generational size, relative size, Generation Z is teeny weeny. So you got to remember, people in the 1990s were not having kids because economic conditions were really tough. So this is a country and it's really, I think, a remarkable aspect of the current moment when people started, there's definitely a generational gap if you look at public opinion about attitudes about Putin, attitudes about the war. But when the war started, that older generation tried very hard to assert primacy over the younger people and basically said, you shut up, you take orders from your commander-in-chief, get in line. And you see this tendency towards, killing individual initiative and enforcing conformism come down, from older generations to the younger ones. And I think that fosters a lot of resentment. But in a hierarchical society like Russia, where older generation people have most of the economic control, it's hard for younger people to say, we are the masters here of our fate.
Well, what do you think is Russia's strategy in Ukraine, and what should NATO's strategy be? From God's lips to our ears, I know again, but still.
So the Russian strategy has changed over time. The first plan A was go to Kyiv, decapitate the government, seize the capital in 3 days, and count on a mass mutiny or abandonment of Ukraine by its armed forces and by the people committed to independence. Putin shifted after being really embarrassed by the wave of setbacks after February 24th to a Donbass first strategy. And we all got ready over the course of the summer for this kind of grueling land war where Russia would take over more of the Donbass. And that didn't work either, largely because of the ability of the Ukrainians to marshal so much military capability in the region and prevent the Russians from making major advances. Then the Russians now are sort of retreating to more defensible lines in places where they're more dug in. And so that's why you see, for example, the abandonment of the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine. And the Russians are now sort of safely back behind the Dnieper River, which is a pretty significant geographical barrier. I don't know what the Russians will do. They've done two things in the here and now. One is they've tried to destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure, having left it largely unscathed. So that's why you see all these attacks on, for example, energy transmission and generation facilities, in the hopes that you're going to make life miserable for average people and perhaps, create a new wave of refugees going into Europe, and that might somehow make European support for Ukraine buckle. I think it's a mistake to assume that. Kremlin has also tried to, cut off energy supplies, particularly natural gas, to Europe, in the hope that there'll be this big economic crisis in Europe. And again, that European leaders would all somehow magically break with the United States and with Ukraine. That hasn't happened. And then lastly is this constant sort of mood music of threat about using nuclear weapons. And I think part of that was not really so much intended to foreshadow that Russia was going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but rather a way of rattling Western leaders and trying to get them to put pressure on the Ukrainians to cool it by, making us all worried that nuclear weapons might come into play. As far as NATO's concerned, NATO's involvement in this war is complicated. NATO keeps insisting that they're 100% behind Ukraine, and they'll be with Ukraine as long as it takes. But it's really largely the United States and the frontline countries that are doing the most to support Ukraine. And that's, a product of the fact that the US has so much more of a military and much more in our, supplies on hand that we can give the Ukrainians, quickly to get them out in the field and able to push back. Other countries in Europe just don't have that. Germany's military is a shambles compared to where it was during the Cold War. It's really, all largely on the US to keep this going. And we're hitting some critical shortages of ammunition and some of the other advanced systems that the United States has been giving the Ukrainians, like these long-range, high accuracy artillery systems, the HIMARS, that have been very effective. The Russians are betting that they can absorb more punishment than we can, and that they've got more staying power than we do. And that, they've seen off Napoleon, they've seen off Hitler, and they'll see off Joe Biden. And their big hope, of course, is that, in 2025, the next US president will be Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, who, threw Ukraine under the bus, even just as a candidate when his candidacy wasn't taken seriously in July of 2016, they're hoping he'll come back and work his magic again. I think the Russians are going to get chewed up a ton between now and 2025. So it seems, again, like the Russians are pinning hopes on things that, theoretically are possible, but aren't really going to, get them out of the jam they're in.
Are sanctions a way to deal with this? Are they going to really hurt? Are they going to really change the course of this war?
Sanctions are an important part of the Western policy response, and we've applied economic pressure on Russia as a result of this war that's largely unprecedented. The challenge is that the way Russia funds itself is not fundamentally disrupted. And the way Russia has funded itself largely is on the back of its exports of hydrocarbons and other natural resources. And because the world doesn't have some of those items in abundance and doesn't have replacements for the things that we buy from Russia, the cash flow that the Kremlin has enjoyed over the past 9 or so months of this war has not gone down. If anything, it's the exact opposite. So if you look at the fact that oil prices drifted higher, they went over $100 earlier in the war, and they've stayed until like the last week, they've stayed, in a band between $90 and $100. It's just been a very profitable time to be in the Kremlin. Imports have been largely crushed because the foreign trade of Russia has collapsed. And so that means there's just more cash on hand. And if you think about how Russia is ruled, largely it's on the basis of distributing that cash. And it's, they've choked a lot of social economic pressures on, they have put off various social programs and spending on social programs to keep the fat cats fat and to keep the military equipped. Plenty of that gets stolen and pilfered. They have not experienced so far a huge amount of sort of social unrest. There have been very few protests in Russia. There's been, pretty much no major defections that I'm aware of high-level people. So it just suggests that if you're looking for sanctions to deliver Putin's head on a plate, a change of policy in Ukraine, elite unhappiness that leads to either a change of regime or a change of direction, or grassroots mobilized anti-regime activity, like it's not happening. And so sanctions aren't the tool for that. But if you're looking to make Russia weak over the long term, more technologically backward, more isolated, and make life more complicated, the sanctions toolkit has been, I think, it plays an important role. But none of this will happen quickly. And we're in this kind of timing mismatch where the West and Ukraine want results right away, and the Russians are saying, we've got all day. And that's a really difficult dilemma for policymakers.
How afraid should we be of what actions Putin might take if the war in Ukraine continues to go badly? What if his hold on Crimea should be threatened, for example?
I think people have started to get quite worried about this, and it's really good that he brought this up. Over the summer, people may have noticed there was a mysterious attack on the major pipelines that carry Russian natural gas to Germany, which are called the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. It's unclear. There's yet to be a formal attribution of the attack. It's unclear if 100% if it was Russia. My assumption is it was Russia that did this, but it definitely has sent a chill into Western governments who are now worried about if this is what Russia is willing to do to its own critical infrastructure, how might they attack ours? There were a couple of scary moments about 3 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, when a anti-aircraft interceptor landed in Poland and tragically killed 2 Poles on the ground. But it gave us a taste rather, of how the situation might escalate, and how Russia might seek to test President Biden or other NATO leaders' commitment to defend every inch of NATO territory. In some of my own scholarly work, I've looked at the question of how Russia uses escalation and dangerous military activities deliberately as a tool to test Western resolve. And we had some dangerous incidents on the ground and in the air in Syria after 2015, where the Russian military would do things that were foolish and that were quite dangerous. And it was only due to the professionalism and the restraint of US commanders and US pilots or US commanders on the ground that nothing really horrible happened. But there was a key moment, which I really do like to focus on, because I think it was super instructive for the Kremlin. In February of 2018, a group of ragtag Russian deniable proxies or mercenaries attacked a US Special Forces outpost in Deir ez-Zor, Syria. And during this attack, series of calls were made from US commanders to Russian counterparts that like this was threatening to the US personnel on the ground and that we take force protection really seriously and that they needed to back off. And the Russian military leadership, when they got these calls, disowned any relationship between themselves and the Russian fighters on the ground. And so General Mattis, who was then the Secretary of Defense, ordered a counterstrike, and up, at least, north of 200 Russians were killed in a very lopsided battle. And I think that sent a very important message to the Russian leadership about U.S. resolve and commitment to defend our people. We'll see if the Russians, start creating equally dangerous situations in parts of Ukraine where they think they might hit a Westerner, or someone connected to the Western effort to keep Ukraine supplied militarily, or in one of these frontline countries, or in the Baltic or the Black Seas. You can imagine scenarios where something dangerous might occur. But I think it's really important that the president, who's been, I think, really clear about this, show resolve and show that, the United States is not to be trifled with.
The subtitle of your book is The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin. I wonder if you could talk about the lies. I think of one right offhand. Remember when the Syrians used chemical weapons in Duma in 2013? Putin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said, yes, chemical weapons were used, but they were used by the opposition forces, the moderate pro-Western opposition. It was a total lie. But maybe you could just sort of, since have lies been part of his life from the KGB days, or is this something that he sort of added to sauce up his presentations?
Early in Putin's public tenure in the public eye, there was a notion that they had to build him up, that they had to make him seem more heroic. And one of the funniest scenes in the book, I'll try to pull this up while we're talking, was when Putin was in East Germany. He was in this tiny little villa in Dresden, and there was a demonstration going on. I'm just going to share my screen. I think this is in December, if I'm not mistaken, of 1989, and this, the East German regime is unraveling, and Putin at this point, but there was this small group of protesters who showed up at the gates of the little villa where Putin was working in his KGB office in Dresden. And he, basically tried to get reinforcements to come in from the Soviet Red Army to get these demonstrators to scram. And Moscow didn't give any approval for such an effort. And so Putin got really mad that the Kremlin was asleep at the switch. But in the retelling, Russians have portrayed this as this amazing heroic moment where Putin single-handedly stood down and defended the KGB office against this group of 1,000 or so protesters. And it's just part of the fabric of making Putin into this heroic figure, when in fact this was a real kind of this thing resolved itself basically under its own sagged under its own weight. But the Kremlin keeps doing this for different parts of Putin's life story. Things just keep changing around, even to this day. His biography is constantly being embellished and rewritten.
And what about the other lies? Were you thinking just of his time as a youth and his time in especially in East Germany? But what about lies as a leader of Russia?
I think the ones about Ukraine are so pervasive, we sort of discount them because we sort of take it for granted that he's making up these absolutely outlandish, preposterous claims about Ukraine. The ones that are in the book that I think people need to focus on, it comes back to this Dresden series of events, is the notion that the U.S. deliberately fomented a revolution in Ukraine in 2014 as a way of creating a dress rehearsal for removing Putin from power. And it's this fear of being removed from office by some, U.S. evil plot that makes me very worried about what Putin is capable of and where this conflict might go. And the reason I mention this is if it's truly existential for him, and it's not just a question of, all the crimes and atrocities that are now being committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, and will someone eventually have to face the music, and how will you provide accountability for war crimes and other things that have happened in Ukraine that are the result of Putin's direction. It's more this direct fear that Putin will end up like Gaddafi did, as someone who's overthrown violently and then doesn't survive, that I think really animates him and may push him into doing dangerous things. And there's another, I'll show it in the book. But, one of the scenes that I think is, most important, and it's also kind of ambiguous, is this event where Putin, as a kid, used to chase rats around the dilapidated apartment building in Leningrad where he grew up. And one of the things that I think is still very telling is, Putin, in this version of the story, corners the rat jumps on him and he backs off. And what we don't know right now is, will the person who's been in power this long and who's built up such a exaggerated sense of his own impact on the world stage, will he back off when we jump on him? And this book opens with the scene where Putin in 1985 nearly derailed his KGB career. And I sort of bring this up whenever someone asks me about what's Putin going to do if he's cornered. In 1985, just to set the scene for everyone, Putin had been waiting 10 years and working in these low-level jobs in the KGB, and he finally got a chance to be in the overseas training program to go to a foreign assignment. And on just a weekend visit to Leningrad, he lost his cool and got into a fight on a subway train and broke his arm. And you can't prove it, but it seems that it was why he was let go from the training program after only 1 year. Most people stayed around longer. And it's how he ended up in Dresden. This was, not where you would put a high flyer. It was where you would put a hothead, which is a word that appears in one of his personnel reports that was published in Putin's sort of mock biography in 2000. Again, it's just like, this is who the guy is. He's kind of a hothead, and he's capable of acting impulsively in ways that get the best of him.
So I guess the parallel today is he's not breaking his arm, but he's sort of breaking the Russian military, and he's breaking Russia. And hot-headedness has led him to the edge of the abyss. So In fact, we had a question: what if Russia wins? What happens to Putin? But is that even a question? Does anybody think it's possible that Russia could win in Ukraine?
I mean, define win. If what win means is that, Ukraine is broken apart, Ukraine becomes a devastated country that's a ward of the West, that never gets back to where it was in February 23rd with, normal people living normal lives. Is that a win? I think for Putin, win originally meant it had to be a new government. It had to be a government that was, beholden to Russia, and Ukraine as an independent country would vanish from the map of the earth. He's not going to get that. I think he's already lost on that. He's not going to be ever, treated like a normal leader. He will always be seen as someone who's responsible for these unspeakable crimes inside Ukraine, and who's going to be a pariah. The problem for us is we're all going to have to live with him and deal with the fact that he's not going to go away tomorrow, and he's not going to crawl out of Ukraine. He's not going to apologize. And we're going to have to deal with someone who feels that he can outlast us, and that, we don't care as much about this as he does. And you see, in our own political system, indications, of people who, give life to such views, which is unfortunate. But, the job of the US president is to show Putin that we are not, we're not squishy, and, he's going to have to deal with a resolute US president. But we have an electoral process. Russia doesn't have an electoral process. So Putin will just keep pinning hopes on stuff that, make this problem seem less acute, and then define that as a win. That's my fear.
Yeah, so the problem is then that Putin doesn't have, as he did when he was in his KGB days, he doesn't have a boss. And there's nobody to demote him, except it sounds like a popular revolution, which doesn't seem awfully likely at the moment, especially considering what you said about the lack of a younger generation, which itself could be the champion of change, as it seems to be in China right now, and in Iran and other places. So anyway, this is profoundly discouraging. But it seems extremely realistic and factual, and I think it's based on the history, and your book really does base itself on the history. I think your alternative title actually isn't quite as good as the title you have. The Spy Who Came in from Middle Management goes only so far, but the life and lies of Vladimir Putin definitely leaves an impact on all of us, and so did tonight's discussion. Andrew, thank you so very much for being here. Thanks so much for your book. Wish you good luck. If my friend's prediction is right, you'll have this will really get around. I think at this holiday season, if there's ever a book for the Generation Z in this country, this might be one of them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roy. I'm really grateful to you. And again, I'm very sorry I wasn't with you today in person.